Joe Rogan and Ice Cube discussed their skepticism toward the COVID-19 vaccine in a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. Let's watch.
Like, especially during COVID, people ganged up on people. People were doing the man's work for the man. It's like, who the f*** are you trusting? Like, why are you trusting these people that have been lying forever?
Yeah, man, it was wild during that time. Like, people being bullied into doing things that they didn't want to do. A lot of them didn't want to do it. They did it because of their work or their their
and a lot
situations. Or a lot of them are hurting right now. I know a guy that's been dealing with tinnitus since he got it, and so
I know a
it's
lot of people
just
that got I know quite a few people that got up.
A lot of expletives there at the end of that we can't play for you. Look, I think it's very true that that there's not just a hesitance, but an utter unwillingness by the experts, the government health advisor community to acknowledge any harm potentially whatsoever, even if it's the case, and I think it probably is the case, that harms from the vaccines are few and far between. I think that they're very dangerous or very harmful is not well demonstrated and is not actually the main criticism I would even make against the vaccines. I think the greater criticism is of their efficacy for people outside of the most at-risk category has been called into question. How much good it's really doing for otherwise younger, healthy people. It's not so much that it's real dangerous, but that the improvement is hard to statistically demonstrate in the studies that have been done, because honestly, at this point, the disease itself is not harming very much in the healthy younger population. So it's hard to show that the vaccine's doing a lot of good.
Yeah. So look, I just I opted to. I wanted to understand what RFK Jr. was actually arguing, because so much of the media criticism of him just gives blanket condemnations of him as anti-vax, something that
kook.
He does not identify as anti-vax. He says he's vaccinated, his children are vaccinated. Right. So I took it upon myself in an episode of my own podcast last week. I went through with Vinay Prasad, who I know people have issues with, that he has been fact-checked by RFK Jr. But frankly, not very many doctors are willing to come to the table and even have the conversation, and I wanted someone with medical expertise. And I went through all of RFK Jr.'s interviews and went through the claims that he's actually made as opposed to the claims that the media makes up that he has made. And one of his issues is that, one, there's a vaccine injury reporting system, and there was a study that was done that showed that it was it dramatically under-reporting the numbers of people who were injured by various vaccines. This isn't a COVID-specific issue. And he says that combined with the reality that there is a liability shield for vaccine manufacturers that anticipates that if they were able to be sued for all of these vaccine injuries, they would go out of business and be unable to manufacture vaccines that are in fact socially beneficial, indicates that there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, and that some further investigation needs to be done as opposed to the cost benefit of these vaccines. And then that combined with a report, and again, I was looking for Dr. Prasad to push back against this a little bit. He wasn't as familiar with this particular report. I think it's called McKinsey & McKinsey. There's a report from the 1970s, which makes the argument that much of the improvements that we've seen in terms of diminished deaths from infectious disease is attributable to better health and better sanitation, as opposed to public investments in vaccines. And that most of the drop-off with these 11 big infectious diseases came prior to the immense mid-century investment in vaccination programs, and that there has been more improvement after that, depending on the disease and incrementally, but that we have to weigh the cost benefits rather. If the vaccines are not actually what can be attributed to the drop in deaths from infectious disease, and we're underreporting the negative side effects of the vaccines, and there are these other issues with testing that he points to, where he believes that a lot of the placebos included the adjuvants, I always mispronounce it, but the components of the vaccine that aren't the virus, but these other substances, which people have argued it has not been proven at all, but which people have raised some concerns about whether those are the things that are causing some of the problems, like rising autism rates or what have you. That those things in combination mean that you have to have more investigation. There just needs to be more research. Not that anyone should stop taking vaccines. Or anything like that, but that there needs to be more research, and perhaps there needs to be more liability exposure for these companies that are putting us in this situation. And there also needs to be more transparency. So the government says they're going to release these COVID files that they declined to release about the origin of the vaccine and the origin of the pandemic and those kinds of things. And that seems really plausible to a lot of people, right?
Right, and that these decisions should be made by individuals in consultation with their doctor. You know, do you want to get a booster? You don't know. You go ask your doctor, and you might say, I already had the vaccine and I had COVID last year and again this year, and do you think I should get another shot? And your doctor might very well say, no, given your risk profile and your general health. They might say, no, there's no need. Like that is a decision that should so obviously be between people in consultation with their own medical profession, in their own lives, and not something that the federal government decides for them, which is really where this conversation should take place, without even getting into the weeds with what he thinks about the vaccine. Would he do something differently than what Joe Biden did when he ordered 80 million people to get vaccinated or lose their jobs?
And this is the focus on mandates is really interesting, because I'm not going to say it's not a public health question, but it is largely a political question as well. I've always been of the mind that the nature of mandates and the civil liberties implications are so significant that it should be a last line of defense. And you should be working overtime to create inducements, carrots, as opposed to the stick that is the mandate. And my view was that the government didn't do enough to help make certain kinds of behaviors that might have helped to stop the spread easier for people. If you want people to stay home, are we going to send groceries to people's houses? Are we going to give them the financial support that they need if they lose their job, et cetera? And I didn't think that enough of that was happening before we got to a point where we started saying, you're going to be fired if you don't take this vaccine. That getting to that place, having mandates at the same time that we now know there was information in the government's possession that vaccines weren't stopping transmissibility, and so the kind of public health argument, at least not in the ways that they initially projected it to do.
It was collapsing at the same time they were making this declaration.
Exactly, and so knowing that in retrospect, to both realize, to know that the justification for the mandates was not authentic, and to pursue this rather extreme public health measure that you kind of knew, or at some point in the process, you knew wasn't going to have the desired effect, is a big problem. And it's what people like Ice Cube and Joe Rogan are reacting to. You're not going to be able to get around that. I mean, the government at some level has to reckon with that and take a moment and say, okay, we maybe thought we were facing a pandemic that was different than the one that we had. We thought we had tools that were going to work differently than the tools that we actually had. We made some bad calculations that had the risks unfairly heaped upon disproportionately working class and vulnerable people. And we're going to learn from that experience and try to figure out how to have a public health response that genuinely is crafted to stop the spread of an infectious disease that did kill over 1 million Americans.
And Biden's mandate didn't have any, even if I don't think it's defensible in any way, but if you're trying to make it more defensible and more palatable to the American people, but there was no exception for people, even though by then we many people in the scientific community were pointing out that if you've had COVID, you probably have about as much protection.
Oh, but that
from
was,
infection
you were not allowed to say that.
You weren't allowed to say,
told you were crazy if you said that.
Right, but it's true, and many people were saying it at the time, and that could have been an exception. It could have been, well, are you a truck driver who never interacts with another human being anyway? But there were no exceptions. It was just declared.
Yeah.
And it was going to affect 80 million people.
Yeah.
Or it was just declared.
I know you don't like this, but masking, and we now know that in terms of transmission, masking is way better than vaccination. So if you're saying that you have whatever health reason, religious reason, whatever, that you don't want to get vaccinated, fine, just say in these contexts, then you have to wear a high quality mask, and the government will buy it for you and send it to your house and make it easier for you.
At that time, they weren't even saying it was that you needed a high quality mask, right? They were saying any mask will do. That was still, the discourse was still at that level, which isn't true.
Which isn't.
I mean, we disagree a little bit about the mask, but what they were saying about the mask at the time, that turned out not to be true.
Or investing in air purifiers, HEPA filters in schools and in public spaces to actually bring down the risk, instead of putting all of the onus on the individual and personal responsibility, as opposed to the structural things the government can do without putting so much pressure on individuals who are trying to earn salaries and go to school and live their lives.
Faith that we're just another round of jabs away from being done with COVID.
Yeah, and look,
they're thinking, and that was not scientifically validated.
In all fairness, I do want to acknowledge that there was a time at which I think there was good faith belief that was going to work.
Yeah.
And I think there was a time where, because it was the first wave and the vaccines were designed for that first wave, it was having more of an effect at stopping transmission at that time, in that first summer of 2001 halcyon phase of the vaccine. But the problem was the government not moving on its feet fast enough and sticking with narratives that served to stigmatize portions of the population to get them to fall in line with a policy agenda that wasn't actually effective. And now they got caught with egg on their face, and there's no amount of social media suppression or anything that's going to prevent people from stating the obvious. And they just have to regroup. I think we need to move past maybe some of the blaming, but there needs to be a regrouping and an acknowledgement of what went wrong, or people are going to continue to feel gaslit and stigmatized. They still walk around with that stigma. And we have to, I also believed what the government was saying. You know what I mean? And I think there needs to be some acknowledgement of where we got it wrong if we want to move forward.
I sort of did, but I've learned my lesson. I got COVID that summer, where we were expecting the vaccines to take care of transmission. I remember still calling it a breakthrough case. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh, that's weird, but that's going to happen to a few people. Within the next 4 months, every single person I knew who was vaccinated got COVID, and who wasn't vaccinated, just everyone got it.
Yeah.
Fun times. More rising right after this.